Hello, everyone. Today we are we have Christie Watson, the best-selling author of Acolo, unde femeile, sunt regi, where women are kings in Romanian, and The Courage to Care, Curajul, pese. These are two books that are already long sellers in our country, and Where Women Are King is a very appreciated reading since the publication a few years ago. So my first question for you is, how did you start to write fiction? Because I know you had a long career as a nurse before writing fiction.
Yeah, I did. And thank you. It's so lovely to be talking to you today. So I always read lots and lots of different books, and I was always a big reader, and I suppose was interested in story. Even in my job as a nurse, I was seeing and witnessing stories everywhere, and the idea that stories and writing and nursing and books all kind of overlapped a bit for me, because they were all really about searching for meaning and looking for meaning and what it means to be human experience. And so although I was nursing for a long time, I think I was always thinking about story. And eventually, when I was on maternity leave, I decided to try and write my own short story. And that short story became my first novel, Tiny Sunbirds Far Away. And I loved it straight away. I felt very much like it felt like nursing, in that it felt like a calling really for me to be writing and to be nursing at the same time. And I carried on doing both jobs for a long time, and they fed into each other, which was great.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think as a nurse, you find out about the condition of the man or woman in front of you, but also their life story, their problems. They are all being combined together.
Yeah, definitely. And because we're all a collection of flesh and blood and bones, but we're all a collection of stories as well. And that's what always fascinated me in nursing, and also in books and in writing.
And have you expected the huge success of your debut novel, Tiny Sunbirds Far Away? Because it was almost an instant success, receiving the Costa First Novel Award and such recognition from critics and public.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting even to be published, let alone any kind of success. But it's interesting because that book, it had been published, it wasn't really doing much, it wasn't really being widely read or reviewed, and it was kind of not making much impact. And then, like you said, it won a prize, and suddenly there was great media interest in the fact that I was a nurse and I'd won a book prize, and then people started reading the book. So I think it's an example of just how important prizes are for particularly debut novelists, where they might not make much noise, but you know, to get on a prize list or something like that does give audiences, I suppose, directs audiences to new voices and new books. So I was eternally grateful for the Costa Prize, and totally unprepared, and I still can't quite believe it. It was a long time ago now, so I'm still shocked that it won that prize, but very, very grateful.
And after Tiny Sunbirds, you wrote Where Women Are Kings. This is a wonderful book. I loved it from the first reading, and as I told you, it's a long seller in Romania. All the characters are so powerful. Please tell us about Elijah, Nikki, Deborah, Obi. How did they came to life?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I'm a bit of a magpie, like lots of writers. I take little pieces of people that I meet. It might be the way someone walks or how somebody speaks, or I'll read something in a newspaper. And so I get inspiration from everywhere, really. And I'd adopted my own son, so I knew about the adoption process in terms of researching that. And I started to think very much and very deeply about children's mental health, identity, transcultural adoption, belonging, what it means to be growing up in a family that's not your birth family, what that means for the adoptive parents as well. So I had all these things going on in my personal life, but the characters are very much just completely fictional. And I think they just came to me. And the first one, of course, that came to me was Elijah. And I wasn't intending to write from the perspective of a small boy. I thought it would be written from the point of view of the adults, but I couldn't stop hearing his voice. I could see his face. You know, he was very, very, very real to me. And I fell in love with this character. And I loved writing Elijah. And although it was incredibly painful, because of course he was real to me, even though he was made up. And actually Jasmine, his friend, was also another character that just came to me very organically, and she wouldn't be quiet. Say, okay, Jasmine, you can be in the book. So it was a magical experience, actually. It was quite abstract and metaphorical, but I could really see these children. And once I had these children and their friendship and their relationship, the other characters just came around that and came as a secondary thing. And I wanted a cast of characters that was really diverse, as London is, as Elijah's family would be. And I guess I also wanted to represent his birth mother, Deborah, who I called Deborah. I wanted to represent her voice as well. So it was important to me that I had her letters slicing throughout the narrative, written from a first person perspective, because I wanted to hear from the birth mum, whose voices we don't often hear from in adoption stories. And so it all centered around Elijah, and he was the person that came alive the most. And I still think about Elijah. It was a long time again since I've written this book, but I think of all my characters, he's the one I fell in love with the most, for sure.
Yeah. We did also, because
I'm glad.
It's hard to forget Elijah. He's wonderful, and this mixture of magical thinking of a child and the harsh reality of his relationship with his birth mother, his relationship with his new family. It's such a rich universe you created around him. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much.
I thank you for this book.
Oh, it's honestly, it fills my heart to hear you say that. It really does, because yeah, and I guess going back to the nursing question that you asked me, I worked as a pediatric nurse, as a children's nurse for decades, and I think I really understood child development and that age of magical thinking, and that came from my nursing. So I'm grateful to my nursing too for allowing me to be able to climb into the mind of a child in that way and inhabit that kind of age of magical thinking. It was very important that he thought in those terms. But yeah, the nursing really helped that book, I think.
These two first fiction books of yours, Tiny Sunbirds, Far Away, and Where Women Are Kings, have a common ground, let's say, Nigeria. What attracted you to this country and African culture?
So my children's dad, who I separated from 10 years ago, but he's Nigerian. And I visited Nigeria. I fell in love with the country. I stayed in love with Nigeria long after I fell out of love with the man. But I found it absolutely fascinating, and Lagos is still one of my favorite places in the world. It's just so full of everything in terms of sensory experience, noises, smells, sounds. It's such a vibrant, endlessly fascinating city. And so I think I was not only falling in love with my characters, Elijah and these other characters that I've had, but I'd fallen in love with the city, and I wanted the country or the city of Nigeria to become a character of its own, really, as well. And although Where Women Are Kings is set in South London, it's still, like you said, it has the thread of Nigeria, and yeah, it's one of my favorite places. But I'm yet to visit Romania, so you never know. I could have a new favorite place.
Yes. Please do come in Romania, because it's a wonderful country.
Yeah.
The mountains, seaside, many places, many interesting places.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
We are expecting you, and this is an official invitation.
Oh, thank you so much.
So let's talk about non-fiction books you wrote. The first was The Language of Kindness, about your experience as a nurse. And the second one, The Courage to Care, a call for compassion. I think we published this book in the right moment, because it was pandemic, and so many people appreciated these stories, and I don't know, the good feeling you have after you read them, although they are sad and profound, and they hide much grief and suffering. So how did you make the translation to writing fiction towards non-fiction?
Yeah, and it's very interesting, because the two books that have been translated for Romania are the two books that did not do as well as my other two books here. So Tiny Sunbirds Far Away and The Language of Kindness did much better in the UK than Where Women Are Kings and The Courage to Care. So it's interesting to me that those have been picked up and well loved in Romania. It's really fascinating how different countries appreciate different things. And I think what you just said about the grief that's hidden, I think was really what I was trying to get at. And perhaps here, people are so wanting hope and happy and joyful stories that I think it was so painful for people to read. But I hope that in The Courage to Care and in The Language of Kindness, I wanted to talk about nursing in a way that reminds everybody and reminded me about what's important, even going through these really, really, really difficult times. And I felt, although I love writing fiction, this is a time for fact. And this is a time for truth. And we're living in such a terrifying world of fake news and isolationism and division and hatred and war and pandemics and, my goodness, everything, that I feel like it felt the right moment to be writing facts about what makes us human, why we're here, what connects us, what unites us. And those things, of course, are suffering and grief, but also love and joy and hope and humor. And so, although I will love to go back to fiction again, it felt like the right form for this world that we find ourselves in at the moment. I don't think it was the right moment for escapism. Maybe now is. It felt like, okay, we need to dig into this. What is going on here? And who are we now? Because we're in such a different world than we were a decade ago. So that led to my choice of writing nonfiction. But I found it really hard, actually. I struggled a lot more in terms of the process. And I'm not a planner. I'm not somebody that thinks very deeply about structure, and you have to with nonfiction. You really have to have that skeleton, that structure. Everything is about the structure and the architecture of the book. So I found that really excruciating for both nonfictions, and had to work really, really hard to try and learn how to plan and be better planner. I'm still working on it.
I wonder if writing The Courage to Care, did you discover any other phases of being a nurse, any other perspective of this job?
Yeah, it was a real psychological journey for me to understand what nursing is, and to understand what it means to other people, including my own family. What does it mean to have a mum who's a nurse? What does it mean to have a daughter who's a nurse? And especially during a time where it's very risky. And the idea that somebody in a family might be putting up strangers' lives ahead of family life. And, you know, all those things are very sticky, grey areas to dig into, but I wanted to explore that. And I felt like I didn't really come up with any answers, maybe more questions, but I certainly felt that something I hadn't really appreciated as much as perhaps was obvious was the teamwork. And I'd always talked about nursing in terms of grit and giving yourself and compassion and all of those things, but I'd never considered what makes it bearable for nurses, and what makes it bearable is your colleagues and your team, and they become like a family. And so for me, writing The Courage to Care and going back to work in the pandemic, it was because I got to stand alongside these men and women who are my heroes, really. They hate that term, but it's true. And to be amongst colleagues who just understand things in a way that outside the hospital people don't really understand. It's a secret language that you are very much part of if you've been in the worst situation of your life with somebody else. I suppose it must be a little bit like being in the military in terms of having these extreme experiences that you can't talk about outside, but you can talk about with those colleagues. And so The Courage to Care definitely made me appreciate teamwork and my nursing colleagues much, much more, and how that for me is the glue that keeps nurses going during even these really awful times. Yeah.
You had a speech at TEDx Vienna, and you talked about compassion fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain it to us, because it's a very interesting.
I know, and it was just before the events in Ukraine, and I was really talking about the dangers of apathy and the danger of not feeling, and the opposite of love isn't really hate, it's not feeling anything at all, it's numbness. And being numb is the most dangerous situation that any of us can be in, because anything can happen because we don't feel. And so it's worse than anger, it's worse than the worst feelings. And so I was really concerned that we had, over the course of pandemic, because things are so dreadful and everyone's suffering, we had become numb and apathetic, and that leaves the door open for atrocities and terrible world events and all those things that, you know, we're seeing now. My feeling when I was doing the TED Talk and planning the TED Talk was that we were living in a very, very dangerous time. And of course, now we know just how dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like during the pandemic we had a window of compassion that closed recently, and was replaced by violence and I don't know, people with an agenda, with an evil agenda.
Yeah.
I agree.
They you know, it was a ripe opportunity when people's curtains closed and they were just, you know, we're overwhelmed as human beings because not only and I'm not sure how it is in Romania, I'm sure it must be the same, but the state of mental health in the UK is absolutely tragic and astonishingly bad, like we've never seen. People are suffering so badly. You know, we're seeing so much in terms of racism, violence, division, hatred, far right agenda, far left agenda. You know, we're seeing shouting and screaming and you know, we're looking at these big world events and people are so overwhelmed with the idea of not only the pandemic, but these other things that are happening, that, and now Ukraine and the war. And of course, something like climate change, for example, is too big for us to even imagine as human beings. Because that is we've had wars, we've had pandemics, we've never had climate change. And so it's almost so big that it's too much to think about. And so we can't think about anything. It's too much. And it just feels really terrifying. It feels like we're suffering existential threats from lots of different places. And so the only way we can deal with that is to shut down a bit and to think about our own families and to try and, you know, just cope on a day-to-day basis. And people here, you know, there's sometimes things are getting very bad financially. You know, I've got a friend that runs a food bank and there are queues around the corner every single day, and it's getting worse and worse in terms of cost of living and people struggling financially, and all these things mean that to think about big world events is very difficult when you have a family to feed and you can't afford to feed them. So it's a really desperate time. And I think, again, going back to the only thing that is going to help is the idea that we are connected, and unity instead of division, and compassion for other families as well as our own, and thinking outside our house and outside our country, because, you know, we are one. And what happens to you in Romania affects me here. What happens to me here affects you in Romania. So I think this idea that we are separatist and individual and we can operate on our own is a lie. It's a myth. And it's a myth that we've held till now, and we need to really change that now. And we're seeing it with the pandemic, because obviously until everybody's vaccinated, nobody's vaccinated. So it's a very depressing chat, isn't it, at the moment? I'm just trying to, we must talk about hope as well.
Okay, I hope my last question will be a cheerful one.
Okay, great.
If you'd have to rewind your life, would you make the same career and personal life choices? Or would you fulfill a crazy dream? I don't know.
It's a really interesting question. I'd like to say that I would do things better, for example, as a teenager, make better choices. But of course, I had to make all those mistakes myself and go through life. I would make exactly the same career choices. I feel blessed and grateful and it's a privilege to have been a nurse and to be a writer. It's a huge privilege to be able to have work that you love. Not everybody has that, you know, and if you find work you love, you're never working. So for me, it's a joy. But I think the pandemic has made everybody look at their own lives, and we're at this vantage point now where we're looking around. It's not the same as it was. It never will be. What do we want to do now? What might we have done differently? And I certainly, if I could wind back 5 years, I would be traveling a lot more. I really would. And so that's the only thing that I think I would have prioritized, going and seeing people, places, things that we lost, you know.
Christie Watson, thank you so much for this interview. It was a joy to have you here in Romania, even if only online. And as I said, we are expecting you to meet your Romanian readers whenever it's possible.
I would love to come. Thank you so much for the chat. It's been really lovely seeing you.